Welcome back to the Love Your Brain podcast, or welcome if you're new. Now, this week on the podcast, we are going to be breaking down everything that you need to know about trauma. Now, here's the thing. I think we hear a lot of information from people about trauma, and particularly in my field, I come from the social work field. We often will categorize trauma in two different ways. They basically call it little t trauma and big T trauma. Now, little t trauma would be small things that happen, things that maybe throw you off course a little bit, but you don't need a lot to get back on course. It doesn't derail your entire life. You're able to resolve it fairly quickly. So, that would be what we call a little t trauma. Now, big T trauma, that's stuff that they make movies about. Completely derails a person's life. That would be like a big T trauma. Now, I'm making these very extreme just to illustrate the point here. But what I want you to realize is that your brain is talking to you always, whether it's a little t trauma or a big T trauma. So, what I'm going to be sharing today is for the person who maybe thinks that they've experienced a ton of trauma, but it's also for the person who thinks they haven't experienced any, because in fact, you probably have. And there are still things that your brain is trying to tell you in such a cool way that we are going to illustrate for you today. Now, trauma, the way I want you to categorize it for the sake of what we're talking about today is forget about little, big, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Did you have an emotional reaction? That's all we're caring about for this example of trauma. If you had an emotional reaction to something that happened to you, that is trauma. That is what happens in your brain when something gets a firm stamp on it, is when you have an extreme emotional reaction. We're going to call that trauma. So it could be something like dropping your favorite vase or getting in a car accident. All of those things elicit an emotional reaction. Now, yes, is there a difference between the heightened emotions in those two different scenarios? Yes. However, they're both imprints that are happening on your brain that are meaningful. And it's important that we pay attention to the meaning. So, the next thing I want you to know about trauma is that we're going to see all of our memories as like files in a filing cabinet. And the analogy here is that everything that happens, every experience that you have, is like a piece of paper that finds a spot in the filing cabinet. Everything has a folder for like items. So, say, for example, your memory of walking your dog this morning, if nothing crazy happened, you didn't have any emotional reaction, that memory is going to get filed in the filing cabinet of your brain in just a file where you've walked your dog a million times. And that file folder, it's given you a belief that you are someone that walks your dog. But other than that, it's not anything notable. And it makes sense. Like that memory of you walking the dog makes sense because you've done that lots of times. So that gets put in a like folder in the filing cabinet. However, if you experience something that creates an extreme emotional response, often that piece of paper, that memory, cannot find a home in your filing cabinet, and that is for a reason, which we're going to get to shortly. But think about this like that memory of that incident where you had a heightened emotional response as a piece of paper that instead getting filed in the filing cabinet, it ends up just sitting on your kitchen counter. Now, I think most of us have these papers, right? It's the paper that can't find a home and it just sits on your kitchen counter forever. And every time you walk past it, you're like, well, shoot, I really need to put that somewhere, but I'm not sure where yet. And it's constantly kind of in your line of sight and it kind of triggers you when you walk by it, right? Like it's that thing that's kind of irritating, but also it's not like consuming you, that piece of paper, right? But it's kind of always in the background, and that's for a reason. What we have to do eventually is sit down with that piece of paper, figure out what its meaning is, figure out what the core meaning is that we need to get from that memory or that situation, and figure out where to file it. But that often takes a lot more intention than obviously just filing away a very basic walk of your dog that's just like every other day that you've walked your dog, because your brain is trying to tell you something. That experience where you had a heightened emotional response happened for a reason. Your brain is trying to teach you something. It's trying to show you something about that experience. And until we take that piece of paper and we sit down with it and we really break it down, it's going to continue to linger and not have a home because we don't know where it's supposed to go in that filing cabinet. We don't know the meaning that we were supposed to gain from it just yet. And here is the funny thing about trauma is that typically, and like I was talking about, big T trauma, little t trauma, from a professional mental health perspective, we do try to categorize things that people experience. And we do try to put general rules on how this is supposed to work. So, say, for example, we take two different scenarios. Say one scenario is a little t trauma. Maybe it's a kid whose best friend moved states away when they were young and they were really, really sad about that. Okay. We are going to say that a professional might call that a little t trauma. And then we have a big T trauma. That would be something like, for this example, we're going to say maybe a kid whose parents abandoned them when they were young and they had to go into the foster care system. Okay, so that we're going to call our big T trauma, something that is massive, probably affected a lot of their life, so on and so forth. From a professional's perspective, those are things on two different ends of the spectrum of trauma. However, what's interesting is if you were to take both of those individuals and sit them down with that piece of paper that's sitting on their counter with that traumatic experience, they could very well have the same root issue come out of that trauma. So let me explain how that happens. Typically, when we experience a trauma, what happens is it's a really big imprint on our brain, and it can cause a new belief or a new script for our brain that it uses to look at all of our experiences going forward, to give meaning to experiences going forward. So, examples of scripts might be something like, I am loved, I am supported, I have everything that I need. People don't like me or people do like me. I'm a great daughter or I'm a terrible daughter. Those are all different beliefs or scripts that our brains often gain from things like traumatic experiences. So again, someone could have gone their entire life thinking they're a great daughter, and then some traumatic experience happens, and now a new script is in place from that traumatic experience when they had a lot of heightened emotions, and now they think they're a terrible daughter, right? That is how this plays out. So if we look at the two different extremes of the example that I gave, the kid whose friend moved away when they were young and the kid whose parents abandoned them, if you sit them down and help them work to the core of their trauma, they could very well come up with the same belief that came out of that experience that has scripted their life going forward. So an example of what that could be is a kid whose friend moved away when they were younger, maybe was very connected to their friend. It was a big part of their support system. Once their friend moved away, they might have felt unsupported. Very similarly to a child whose parents abandoned them, and then they felt unsupported in a very similar way. And both of those individuals' lives could look drastically different because of the script that's been put in place. I am not supported. So that is personally why I think we should just erase the idea that we need to categorize people's trauma into like extreme or not extreme. If it had an emotional reaction for you, no matter what it was, then it is meaningful and it's your brain's way of telling you there is something that you need to gain from that. I'm going to give you kind of an example of how the professionals threw off my own ability to get to the root of my trauma in kind of a funny way. It's not going to sound funny at first, but stick with me till the end. So, I grew up in a home where my mom struggled with addiction. She was addicted to prescription pain medication for most of my life. And this started pretty much in the 90s before they knew that certain pain medications could be extremely addictive, and she had really intense migraines. So they had prescribed her medications, then found out that this is really dangerous. We need to get her off of these. but they also realized that it wasn't going to be something that she could do on her own. So she had to go inpatient and they had to medically supervise her coming off of this medication. And for me, at this point, I'm in elementary school. And for this period of time, while my mom was in the hospital, I went and stayed with family. Loved the family that I stayed with. They're wonderful. That was not part of the issue at all. However, I will tell you, if you were to talk to any kind of traditional mental health provider, there would be a couple different routes that they would probably go to help me find the root of this trauma, which has happened because I've been to plenty of those. They usually would go the route of, you're probably struggling with a belief that you have to show up for your mom in a certain way because you had to be in a caretaker role, or you probably struggle with letting go of control because your environment was so unstable, or they come up with a million different reasons, right? And none of those really aligned with how I was feeling until I did the work myself of really sitting with this memory. And it took me back to this time when my mom went to treatment and I was staying with family. And again, you're probably going to think this is so funny, but it was all related to me having the perfect ponytail. Now, I always loved to have this very perfect ponytail with no bumps. It had to be perfect, which is funny now because my hair is always wild and curly. But when I was younger, having my hair in a perfect ponytail was very important. And even though my mom did struggle with addiction, she always made sure my hair was done before I went to school. And it was a very big deal for me. I wanted my hair to look good before I went to school. And while she was in the hospital, I didn't have anyone that I felt like could make my hair perfect for school. And for whatever reason, that is the pain point of all the years of trauma related to my mom's addiction. That is the root of the pain of the issue for me. That is where the trauma really happened, where it put an imprint on my brain of I am not safe. And I know that sounds silly, but as a kid, thinking that you have to go to school with crazy looking hair and potentially be embarrassed and made fun of. Now, those things didn't actually happen, but I was terrified that they would happen. And that fear that I could be made fun of because of my hair looking crazy because my mom's in the hospital created this imprint on my brain, this belief or this script of I am not safe. And that has stuck with me for the last 30 years of my life. But every mental health professional I went to could not get to that. They always went with these broad stroke ideas of what typically would happen to a kid who was raised in a household with a parent struggling with addiction. And nowhere in those normal scripts is there oh, make sure that they didn't have a situation where they couldn't have a perfect ponytail. That's not a part of how mental health practitioners are usually trained. So I say all of this to say your brain is so special and it's so unique. It's literally not like any other brain on this planet. So if you are sitting here today, maybe thinking, nothing that I've tried to try and get to the root of my trauma has helped, or it doesn't seem like I should have trauma because I had a really good life, but I feel like I might have, but I'm not sure what it is. You're right. You are right. There is something there that your brain is trying to tell you by keeping that paper on your counter, kind of in the background, telling you there is something to unpack there. And that is something that I love helping people with. I love helping people with really just being able to trust their brains a little bit more, that their brain is trying to tell them something that's actually important and meaningful. Because once I was able to get to the root of what that belief was or that script was, that I am unsafe, that was impacting every area of my life, it was a total game changer. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. Obviously, reprogramming that belief and that script, it takes time, but it's so much more manageable than having that piece of paper on my counter forever and ever. Amen. I feel like I'm finally starting to get to the place where that paper is able to start finding its home in my filing cabinet. And what a relief that is to have. And everyone should have that feeling. And your brain is giving you all the information, all the puzzle pieces that you need to make that happen. So I say all that to say I am going to be launching a full spectrum of one-on-one sessions come June 1st, 2026. So if you're listening to this during that period of time, definitely keep your eyes open. I'll be putting some links in the show notes so that you can kind of follow along as we launch this. But I'm really excited to be able to walk alongside other people that are going through a similar journey. And there's just so much that we can uncover because our brains really are incredible. They're trying to tell us something, and we just have to listen. So hopefully that gave you some hope today that if you are someone who's been struggling, or maybe you don't even feel justified in your struggle, that there is something there meaningful that your brain is trying to tell you. And it's going to be really cool on the other side. Now, if you haven't already, please make sure you leave this podcast a review so that more people in the world can find us. Make sure you're subscribed and share this with a friend. You never know what someone's dealing with, and this could be the encouragement that they need today. Thank you, as always, for joining along, and have a great week.